Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and good day everyone. Let's continue with today's lesson, subtopic 7.2, acid-base titration. At the end of the lesson, you should be able to describe the titration process, distinguish between the endpoint and equivalence point. Titration is a process of reacting a solution of unknown concentration with one of known concentration or a standard solution. There are several types of titration, namely acid-base titration, redox titration, precipitation titration, and complexometric titration. But for today's lesson, as in the subtopic 7.2 per se, we'll be focusing on the acid-base titration. There are a few important keywords in the acid-base titration. The first one is a titrant. It is a solution of known concentration that is added or titrated to another solution to determine the concentration of a second chemical species. The titrant may also be called the titrator, the reagent, or the standard solution. Titrant is placed in an apparatus called burette, as shown in the picture. The second one is the analyte. It is the substance whose quantity or concentration is to be determined. It is reacted with a carefully controlled volume of solution of accurately known concentration called a standard solution or titrant. Analyte is placed in an apparatus called conical flask. Next is the indicator. It is added to the solution in the receiving vessel or conical flask, which undergoes some sort of color change when reaction is over. Only few drops of indicator are needed in a titration. Next, the equivalence point. Equivalence point is the point at which the amount of acid and base present exactly neutralizes one another. In simple words, the equivalence point is a point in which the number of mole of hydroxide ion is equals to the number of mole of hydroxonium ion or hydrogen ion. Endpoint is the point when the indicator changes color. Moving on to the titration curve. A titration curve is a graphical representation of the pH of a solution during a titration. In learning about the titration curve, you'll need to know how to sketch the curve. No graph paper is needed since it only involves sketching. First, let's learn about the possible shape of the curve. Previously, you have known the terms analyte and titrant. The shape of the curve is pretty much depending on those two. When you have an acid as the analyte and a base as a titrant, the shape of the curve should be like this. Or, if it's the other way around, the shape of the curve should be like this. Basically, the shape of the curve is somewhat an S-shaped curve. The second important element in a titration curve is the equivalence point. For any titration that involves strong acid and strong base, the pH of the equivalence point is 7. In the titration that involves strong acid and weak base, the pH of the equivalence point is less than 7. And lastly, the equivalence point that involves the titration between weak acid and strong base, the pH of the equivalence point is more than 7. Before I end the first part of the acid-base titration video, here are some key takeaways. There are only two possible shapes of the curve. It's either like this or this. Next is the pH of the equivalence point. For a strong acid and strong base titration, the pH of the equivalence point is 7. For a strong acid and weak base titration, the pH of the equivalence point is less than 7. And lastly, for a weak acid and strong base titration, the pH is more than 7. Till the next video, bye!